Back to money. This is the projected cost throughout the country of implementing Common Core, almost $16 billion. And notice where most of the money is going. So logically, most technology companies would support Common Core in every way possible because it means an additional $6 billion to their market. So, and you'll notice too, the one-time cost is $10 million, but the ongoing cost involves technology and testing. So you notice the two biggest players and the people who are putting the most money on the line for Common Core are the people doing the testing and the people in technology, because it'll be a continual stream of revenue as long as it exists. This is a chart that someone put together of the relationship of the different entities, and it looks slightly more confusing than a spider web. So I'm not even going to go over it, but that's how complex it is. It is not standards, obviously. Getting into longitudinal data systems, that would be all this green part. The National Education Data Model, that was created by the U.S. Department of Education to standardize state information databases. And the original one, which included data points like religious affiliation, political affiliation, it only took them about a week to take it off their website. So since they've replaced it with a scaled down one, but that doesn't change the fact that the states adopted the original one, not the version 2.0, so just a little bit of deception going on there. And then also the National Education Data Model involves EDEN, the Educational Data Exchange Network, which is summarized on their own website. The Educational Data Exchange Network and EdFacts are a federally mandated data collection and storage system through which states submit their educational data to the U.S. Department of Education. States submit K through 12 education data on approximately 100 data groups at the state, district, and school levels to the U.S. Department of Education. Critical directory data is submitted, as well as data on schools, services, staffing, students, and educational outcomes. If you search for the site, it no longer shows up on Google as of a couple days ago. I found this about a week ago, and they were quick to kind of hide it, obviously. But that is pretty obvious, and it's hard to misinterpret that. The U.S. Department of Education is deliberately hoarding up student data for what reason, we don't know, other than the fact that there's power in data. And also, I want to touch a little bit back on the privatization of business. This is Wireless Generation. It was a startup company, but in 2010 it was acquired by Rupert Murdoch's business empire, News Corporation, for $360 million, which is about 10 times what it was worth. And it also, in 2012, received a $1.2 million grant from the U.S. Department of Education with no specific reasoning behind. I think it's completely absurd that the U.S. Department of Education is writing grants to nonprofits, much less for-profit companies, and not telling anybody why or what they're doing it for. Then I want to talk about something else. Sorry if I'm skipping around and blowing your mind, but there's so many myths that can be dispelled just by looking at evidence. You'll see all the time where they say that we don't rank high compared to top performing companies or countries. This is the results of the TIMSS test in 2007, and you'll see that Massachusetts standards, which were considered the best in the U.S., rank higher than Hong Kong as well as all these other countries. And you'll see Minnesota standards and Asian American test subjects scored higher than a lot of these countries. Tom Kimbrell mentioned that in the hearing that they had traveled to Finland because Finland is considered a top performing country, and they wanted to look at how Finland does its education and see if they could learn from Finland. Finland didn't even make it on this list. I'm not sure why they went to Finland. But anyway, something else they don't say is each one of these yellow countries, the yellow bar represents that the leading cause of death among teenagers is suicide, which is interesting because in most Asian countries, it's mainly their culture, but the way their education system is patterned, it puts so much pressure on teenagers to perform high that many end up committing suicide due to the pressure. So is that where we want the U.S. to go either? I mean, yes, they score higher on tests, and yes, they have national standards, but yes, there are consequences to that result. Let's see.
Where's Germany on here? You know it?
It's not.
It's not.
No. Let's see here. And I want to touch one more thing. This is the race to the top requirements. They'll say over and over that no one was forced to adopt Common Core standards. It was all voluntary. Here's the actual requirements from the application. 70 points came from adopting common standards from the Common Core State Standards Initiative and develop and implementing common high-quality assessments. Then 47 points came from data systems to support instruction, fully implementing a statewide longitudinal data system, accessing and using state data. So almost 1/4 of the points for this grant came from Common Core standards and adopting that data model. So any state that applied that did not do those two things alone would fail, just from the weighting of the points. None of these other things mattered unless you did that and that. You were not going to receive any grant money. And we even did that and still didn't receive any grant money in Arkansas. So we kind of got gypped a little bit. We adopted the core standards and got the whole package that came with it, with all the assessments and the curriculum and all that mess, and we still ultimately didn't benefit from the original sales pitch. I spoke to at the hearing a little bit about my experience with Common Core this past year. I was in a math course that the teacher, I've talked to her since then, and she said that she didn't really want to implement Common Core, but was kind of coaxed into it, sales pitched into it more or less, and it was not good at all. Basically, the teaching model that was being provided to her went something like this. The day before she would teach a concept, she would give us a worksheet on that concept so that we could do something that we didn't know how to do, so she could see that we didn't know how to do it. And then the next day we would have a lesson which we were sitting in little groups and we were collaborating, and there was really no real teaching and instruction going on. It was just kind of discussing it and exploring it and whatever else verbs they want to use to describe it, but it was not instruction. And then we would do some sort of activity in class, most of the time some sort of group activity. Then we would have a homework assignment, then we would come back the next day, and most people would not have passed the homework assignment, and she would teach it a little more. Then we would get another worksheet for something else we didn't know and repeat the process all over again. And it was extremely ineffective, and I personally know quite a few people who are in that course again this year because they did not pass the course. If you add assessments on top of that, I can't even imagine how it's going to be the next few years. It was just terrible. And I've even talked to her, and she handed me and let me borrow the copy of the binder that she was given and that she was using. And it has laid out lessons. Do this, give this to the student. And this was something she received at a State Department of Education workshop. It's about a 550-page long binder of lesson plans. Here's what to do. Give this to your student. Give this, do this, tell them this. Like, it's almost a completely scripted set of lessons. And that is just a horrible step for education.
We had an elementary school teacher tell us that she was not allowed to show our students how to do certain stuff. They had to figure it out on their own.
You're right.
Oh, that didn't go over real well with this mama.
Yeah. So that's pretty much
Because
all.
then when my child came home and wanted me to show her how to do it, I showed her how to get the answer.
Yep.
But that wasn't good enough.
So that's pretty much it for me. So Denna's going to speak next, and then we'll get to some questions.
When are you running for office?
Hey, at the legislature, when he finished, he got a standing ovation.
Oh, imagine.
Randy Alexander said, "I'm 62, Patrick. When I grow up, you're who I want to be."
Yeah.
I'm just blown away. He did such a wonderful job. I remember way back when I was 15 years old, and I would have been petrified to get up before an audience and speak, but you did an excellent job. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Denna Slade. She is a mother and a grandmother. In the mid-1980s, she and her husband fought for the right to homeschool in Arkansas. This decision precipitated a career change since Mr. Slade was a public school administrator. She recently became involved with studying and educating others about Common Core. Her topic: who's driving the bus? Where are they taking us? And what can we do?
I almost feel like I could just sit down and you wouldn't miss too much. But I want to first just add a note to what has already been said before I start my speech. Talking about these data points. When we were at the committee meeting in Little Rock, they made a big deal about the fact that it doesn't exist, it hasn't existed, it won't exist type thing. And I just want to read you a little bit of what I had to say to them. There was this expanded list that they were talking about that had over 400 suggested data points on the national education, whatever data place, and those disappeared, like Patrick said, and they came back with a cut down list. And I went on to tell them some politicians and social do-gooders want to live anonymously, doing their business behind closed doors, while collecting detailed personal data on every aspect of others' lives to be used for education, or maybe just as easily for targeting elections, discrimination, or whatever need justifies the means. Such invasion of privacy is akin to the physical acts of breaking and entering, unlawful search and seizure, and flies in the face of all privacy laws. So the data thing is a big thing, like we saw in that chart, and so don't ever let them tell you that it doesn't exist. These three questions, who is driving the bus, where are they taking us, and what can we do about it, are questions that I ask myself as I begin to study about Common Core and figured out that this is not state-led like they had led me to believe. And as I make this presentation, and with all the things that you've already heard today, hopefully we can find some answers to these thought-provoking questions. The proponents of Common Core, of course, want us to believe that states are driving that school bus or that Common Core bus. They would have us believe that the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers equal state-led. and that somehow that equals individual and community-led. There's 3 points that dispel that notion, and I think we've kind of gone over it, is that the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers have no power or authority to do what they did. They have no authority to act in our behalf. No more authority to act in our behalf than I have the authority to write checks or sign contracts in your behalf. And so we know about that, the fact that they circumvented the legislation, and my question is, why did they circumvent our legislators if it was state-led? It would have been a shoo-in. It wouldn't have been a problem. Okay, and then we did not know anything about it like we've talked about. So if it is not state-led, like they proclaim, then who is driving the bus? Grace talked to us a little bit about, and also Mr. Endicott talked about David Coleman, and we're going to hear a video about David Coleman from him. He is the...
One of them is the Common Core standards. And most people, when trying to understand how that could have happened, right? In other words, how could it be that in a country locked against itself that something broke in this way? When I was involved in convincing governors and others around this country to adopt these standards, it was not Obama likes them. Do you think that would have gone well with the Republican Democrat? Shouldn't you instead be meeting with the Council of Chief State School Officers? Those of you who say that probably have not attended as many of those meetings as I have. And they might wonder whether we had a legion of talented lobbyists or friends in the right places. Tom, who knows me well, knows how pathetic the beginnings of the Common Core Standard movement were. Think of a napkin. Think of a few people in a room with an idea.
Okay, so does that sound like state-led? He went to the governors and sold it to the governors, and then they were created with a few people in a room with a napkin. If the power was with the states, as the Common Core advocates claim, there would be no copyright. There would be, the states would not have to be baited and coerced into accepting unseen standards. There would be no need for millions to be spent by foundations, corporations, federal government, and public and private partnerships to bribe groups into supporting and pushing these said standards. And education administrators and teachers would feel free to voice concerns without retribution or the loss of jobs and privileges. I want to just refer to Patrick's flow chart. He did a great job of explaining it, so I'm not going to try to explain it, but just look at standards and assessment. Who do you see? Federal government, Gates Foundation, federal government, Gates Foundation, then Gates Foundation for curriculum, federal government, and Gates Foundation, federal government, and Gates Foundation. Then all over it is Pearson, ETS, Achieve with PARCC, and all this kind of stuff. So this chart clearly shows some of the key players, and it is not you or me or our communities or our state. And it also gives us a broader vision of who is driving that bus. And though that might be self-appointed elitist and federal government officials. Going on to Arnie Duncan, well, this is that same flow chart we've looked on. I'm just going to bypass that. But Arnie Duncan, who we've already heard from once, the Secretary of Education, the current Secretary of Education, had this to say to the American Society of News Editors when explaining to them how they needed to be reporting on Common Core. And he says, the federal government has nothing to do with curriculum. Is that what we've heard today? In fact, we're prohibited by law from creating or mandating curriculum. And so we know that the Department of Education is prohibited from creating and mandating, yet they coerced, urged, cajoled, and bribed American educators into joining the Common Core State Standard Initiative. They funded testing and the testing consortia, and made sure that they would report back to them with all the data. The Department of Education then outsourced to others to collectively produce the federally approved education reform agenda known as Common Core. So they had nothing to do with creating that curriculum. While the proponents of Common Core assure us that these are just standards and do not control curricula, I beg to differ. As has been presented today, standards drive the test, and the test drive the curricula. There is a massive, unmistakable Department of Education fingerprints all over the promotion, marketing, and funding and imposition of these said standards. As a child, I was always taught that when you pick up one end of the stick, you also pick up the other. So when we picked up the end of the stick called Common Core, we also picked up the assessments, the curricula, and the control of ideas. And Joseph Calafono, who was the Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary, said it best: any set of test questions that the federal government prescribes should surely be suspect as a first step toward a national curriculum. Carried to its full extent, national control of curriculum is a form of national control of ideas. And I want to ask, whose ideas? Research shows that the federal government and many radical reformers permeate every facet of these standards and their aligned tests and curriculum. They are a one-size-fits-all attempt coming closer to control of ideas than education. Patrick just explained the financial gains of the Bill and Linda Gates and the Pearson and countless others, what they have to gain financially by promoting and coming up with the Common Cores. But let's look at the philosophical reasons these same entities have and what social reforms in the name of education they are seeking. Let's look at Bill Gates here. Bill Gates, when asked what matters most to him, said education. Microsoft signed a cooperative agreement with UNESCO in 2004 to fund or create a global education system. Gates and Microsoft support the objectives of UNESCO. Gates is funded with over $150 million. He's partnered with Pearson, and he's also partnered with Achieve. So that ties them all in together. So UNESCO, what are their philosophies when it comes to mandating education? They say, downplay nationality in teaching lest the kids identify too strongly with their country. Right. Teach peace, defined by the UN as more than the absence of war, requiring social equity, or in other words, redistribution of resources. Number 3, teach sustainable development. That's one thing that major thing that Gates signed on to was education for sustainable development. Go to the UN site, look it up. And there's a lot of research that can be done there. Putting resources out of reach and redistributing others under the guise of social and environmental justice. Teach local to global activism. Execute UNESCO's educational objectives and report back to UNESCO on activities and results. UNESCO also has a massive data system. Another quote that I found that dealing with UNESCO that I thought was interesting goes like this: as long as the child breathes the poisoned air of nationalism, education in world-mindedness can produce only rather precarious results. As we have pointed out, it is frequently the family that infects the child with extreme nationalism. The school should therefore use the means described earlier to combat family attitudes that favor jingoism, or in other words, extreme nationalism. So what's the bottom line? The biggest roadblock to UNESCO and to the globalists in creating a world-mindedness is parents teaching their own children about this great land in which they live. Are they concerned? Is UNESCO concerned about American sovereignty?
Yes.
Or is it global mindedness and world mindedness? Next philosophy we want to look at is Pearson, a great big player. Pearson is the textbook assessment teacher training mogul. And Sir Michael Barber of England is the Chief Education Advisor at Pearson and a Common Core promoter extraordinaire. He is also a global education standards promoter. Barber talks about sustainable reform as irreversible reform, and he directs education policymakers to make it so it can never go back to how it was before. If you want irreversible reforms, work on the culture and the minds of teachers and parents. Maybe this is why the teachers have to go through so much instruction on Common Core, I don't know. Otherwise, he says, people might repeal what's been done because of their wish for the past.